The moment Europe entered the Oreshnik era, and the strategic balance quietly broke, the decisive moment arrives not with speculation, but with declaration, because the announcement that Oreshnik is entering combat duty by the end of the coming year instantly shifts the strategic balance in a way that cannot be walked back. And this analysis begins right there, at the point where deterrence turns into an active clock that Europe, willingly or not, has begun to hear ticking. What happened here is not simply the unveiling of another weapon system, but the confirmation that a nuclear-capable intermediate-range hypersonic missile, already tested in real combat conditions, is moving from demonstration to deployment, which, in my opinion, marks a line of demarcation between an era of theoretical threat and one of immediate, actionable reach. The intensity of this moment comes from the stated performance of Oreshnik itself, because a system capable of traveling at hypersonic speed, described as reaching velocities that make interception nearly impossible, forces existing air defense concepts into a reactive posture rather than a preventive one, altering the psychology of defense planning across the continent. When the text makes clear that even the most advanced air defense systems are effectively outpaced, the implication is not technical, but strategic, since defense is no longer framed as a shield, but as a gamble, and that alone reshapes how military and political leaders must calculate risk under pressure. In my opinion, the most consequential shift is not the missile's speed or range, but the explicit acknowledgement that Europe is now directly within its operational envelope, because naming capitals such as London, Paris, Berlin, and Brussels removes abstraction and replaces it with immediacy. This is the point where perception changes, because once cities and political centers are openly described as reachable within minutes, the conversation moves away from distant battlefields and toward homeland vulnerability, which historically has always produced faster, more cautious policy shifts. The description of launch readiness, with emphasis on speed, precision, and minimal warning time, introduces a psychological dimension that matters as much as the physical one, because uncertainty becomes the dominant factor shaping reactions rather than raw destructive capability alone. What stands out here is that Oreshnik is not framed as a weapon designed solely for the current conflict space, but as a broader message, which suggests that its true function lies in redefining red lines rather than simply crossing them. The fear reshaping European defense policy is therefore not abstract, as evidenced by Germany's rapid move toward acquiring a missile defense system explicitly designed to counter threats of this nature, signaling a reactive adjustment rather than a proactive strategy. At the same time, Britain's noticeably more cautious tone regarding deep strikes reflects how quickly rhetoric can soften when strategic vulnerability becomes personal, illustrating how weapon systems influence political language long before they are ever used again. Another turning point emerges with the decision to deploy Oreshnik in Belarus, because choosing a top ally that also borders NATO territory is not a logistical choice but a deliberate positional statement that compresses response time and amplifies pressure. The statement that these systems have arrived and are operationally ready transforms speculation into reality. And in my view, this is where the balance of power visibly tilts, as readiness removes ambiguity and replaces it with permanence. When the narrative expands to include regional groupings of forces and the concept of a second echelon joining immediately in case of escalation, it becomes clear that Oreshnik is embedded within a wider framework of rapid mobilization, rather than standing alone. Belarus being described as going first is not a throwaway phrase, because it defines a forward posture that shifts the initial burden of confrontation closer to NATO borders, while retaining strategic depth through Russian support. The repetition of the phrase emphasizing the need to react underscores urgency, and psychologically, repetition in such statements often signals internal certainty rather than external persuasion, reinforcing the sense that plans are already in motion. When tactical nuclear weapons are mentioned as having returned to Belarus alongside these missile systems, the analysis must pause, because this combination creates layered ambiguity that complicates any attempt at preemptive assessment by potential adversaries. The equipping of the first positions for Oreshnik and its entry into combat duty removes the final barrier between concept and execution, and at this stage, deterrence no longer rests on capability alone, but on visible deployment. The classification of Oreshnik as the first post-Soviet intermediate-range ballistic missile places it within a historical context of regained capacity, suggesting continuity rather than innovation as the guiding narrative. Its ability to carry multiple, independently targetable warheads mounted on maneuverable hypersonic re-entry vehicles elevates the threat profile, because unpredictability becomes a feature rather than a limitation, complicating defensive calculations. The fact that these warheads can alter course mid-flight and approach from unexpected angles is less about technological bravado and more about signaling that established interception models are being intentionally undermined. Most chilling, in my opinion, is the acknowledgement that there is no way to know whether the missile carries a conventional or nuclear warhead until impact, because this ambiguity alone compresses decision windows and raises the risk of catastrophic misinterpretation. The confirmation that a pre-production variant of Oreshnik was already used in combat against a Ukrainian industrial site transforms the system from a projected threat into a validated one. Because once a weapon has crossed the threshold of operational use, even in limited form, its credibility multiplies in the eyes of planners, analysts, and decision-makers across the Atlantic. The reference to Russian state media calculations about flight times to Poland and to NATO headquarters in Brussels introduces a temporal dimension that is deliberately unsettling, since the emphasis on minutes rather than hours reframes defense not as a layered response, but as an almost instantaneous crisis management scenario. In my opinion, these time estimates are not primarily about accuracy, but about conditioning perception. Because once policymakers internalize the idea that response windows are measured in moments, restraint becomes structurally embedded into strategy. This is where Europe is watching and Washington is calculating, not out of curiosity but out of necessity, because the emergence of such systems forces a recalibration of escalation ladders that were previously built around slower, more predictable technologies. The statement that the clock is already ticking, attributed directly to Vladimir Putin, functions as a rhetorical compression of time, signaling that deliberation itself may soon be a luxury rather than a default mode of action. When attention shifts to the broader military context, including acknowledgement that Ukraine is backed by NATO's immense potential, the narrative reframes Oreshnik not as an isolated development, but as a counterbalance to a perceived structural disadvantage. The emphasis on constant flows of military aid, intelligence sharing, advisors, and instructors establishes the justification framework within which the deployment of such systems is presented as reactive rather than provocative. From an analytical standpoint, this framing matters because it positions Oreshnik as a response to an environment already defined as hostile, which in turn influences how neutral observers interpret subsequent moves. The repeated focus on combat readiness and training highlights continuity rather than emergency, suggesting that what we are witnessing is the visible phase of long-term preparation rather than a sudden escalation born of panic. The description of ongoing qualitative improvements in command, control, and operational training reinforces the idea that the system's deployment is synchronized with institutional adaptation, not merely hardware delivery. In my view, the discussion of the defense industry restructuring production and technological processes is crucial because it signals sustainability, implying that Oreshnik is not a one-off capability, but part of a broader, scalable military ecosystem. When ground forces are described as receiving high-precision missile systems, loitering munitions, unmanned aerial vehicles, and advanced robotics, the implication is that hypersonic systems are integrated into a multi-domain approach rather than standing apart. The aerospace forces receiving upgraded missiles and guided aviation bombs capable of operating in complex jamming environments further reinforce the theme of layered modernization rather than isolated breakthroughs. The reference to efficiency increases reaching very high levels serves a dual purpose, because it reassures domestic audiences while simultaneously signaling to external observers that production bottlenecks are being overcome. Naval expansion with new submarines, surface ships, and strategic missile carriers broadens the deterrence narrative, framing Oreshnik as one pillar within a triad of capabilities, rather than as a singular focal point. The successful tests of systems like Oreshnik and Poseidon, described as unique and unparalleled, extend the message beyond Europe, reminding global actors that strategic parity is being pursued across multiple vectors. By stating that these systems will ensure security parity for decades, the narrative shifts from immediacy to longevity, suggesting that the current moment is not a peak but a foundation. The repeated reaffirmation that Oreshnik will be deployed by year's end closes the loop, returning the analysis to its starting point and reinforcing inevitability rather than contingency. Mention of joint strategic exercises with allies and partners emphasizes normalization, because regular exercises signal that these capabilities are already embedded in routine military planning. The claim that all tasks to protect Union state security were successfully accomplished serves as a concluding assertion of readiness, leaving observers with the impression that the strategic transition has already occurred. Taken together, what happened here is not simply the arrival of a new missile, but the quiet crossing of a strategic threshold, where uncertainty, compressed time, and deliberate ambiguity redefine deterrence itself. And this is precisely the moment where viewers are invited to reflect, react, and weigh the consequences, because the implications of this shift will continue to unfold long after the headlines fade.